Israel's basically surrounded right now. They're getting hit from Syria. They get hit by the Houthis. They get hit by the Hamas folks in Gaza. It's just one, it really is kind of a circular attack going on, limited as it may be, and terrorist organizations funded by Iran. But, Iran's a big elephant in the room. They're the ones behind all this. And now we're talking about maybe Iran directly striking Israel itself, adding a whole new element and dynamic to this.
I think it's important, though, to look at the context because these things don't come out of nowhere. They come out of very specific things. And just prior to this, well, actually, let's back up a little bit because it's important. You had back in April, Iran had this big, unprecedented 350 drone missile strike against Israel that the United States, several other countries used their Air Force to actually knock down most of them. The Iron Dome did its work. But all of that came as a result of what Israel destroyed an Iranian embassy building in another capital city of Syria.
Yeah.
And that prompted the response. This time, Israel assassinated the lead negotiator for Hamas, who they were trying to negotiate a ceasefire with, which the United States was strongly behind.
Right.
And now then they did it in Tehran, and now then there's a risk that Iran's going to retaliate. Now, I personally think that the fact that it didn't come last night is indications that maybe our diplomacy, which has been like 24/7 right now, starting from the top on down, may have had a possible success at pushing this off. And I don't know what kind of deal could be struck that's going to satisfy Iran in this case, but that's the part of the problem is that if you take an action, you can expect a counteraction. So these things don't come cost free, and we'll see how it plays out.
Well, and I hope diplomacy works. Lord knows we don't need a global conflict breaking out. Do we have, and I guess I've always been operating under perhaps the mistaken presumption, and this is why we have you, Daniel Davis. Do we have a defense agreement with Israel? I know we have pledged to help defend them. We've offered them arms and support and diplomacy and whatever else is in our arsenal. But if they were to be attacked, nation state with a flag and an army, attacking Israel, that could be considered a war, a declaration of war, much in the same way Israel hitting Iranian territory, which an embassy is considered. And of course, in Tehran, that could be viewed by the Iranians as an act of war. Ergo, if they end up in a shooting war between the two countries, are we going to have boots on the ground in Israel or any place else in the region?
Yeah, that is the absolute number one question for the United States right now. And just taking this thing on the substance of it, it is absolutely undeniably an act of war. Whether the Iranians choose to act on that and to launch into a war is a separate question because they have to do their own calculations of cost benefit. And if we respond to this, what would be the consequence? Would we win? Would we lose? Would it cost us even more to try, et cetera? But part of this is their deterrent calculation because they think that, okay, if we don't do something, then Israel's going to keep on hitting us. I mean, just imagine if any nation on the planet took out somebody in Washington, D.C. with a missile and blew it up. I mean, we would lose our minds. We would be ready to go to war later that afternoon. So
we're allowed to do that, but nobody else can do it to us.
Right. And to answer the second part of your question, we do have I'm not sure exactly which year it started, but we have a 10-year agreement to give $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year. It is not a mutual defense treaty. There is no Article 5 type like there is in NATO that an attack on one is an attack on both, et cetera. There's none of that. It did not go into that level. We just said we will help them defend themselves. And listen, the reason why we give them that money is so that they can protect themselves, and they can. They have the capacity to protect themselves, to fight their own war should they get into one, as happened in 1967, 1973. We didn't fight for them on those cases. They fought for themselves. Now then, we've given them a lot more support than they had prior to those wars. So it is vital, in my view, vital that the United States not get dragged into a war, because if we get involved with something like that, it can have all kinds of unintended consequences, not the least of which is it could cause casualties to the United States and no apparent benefit. If Israel gets into a war, especially because it takes provocative action in the capital city or against another nation state, that's something I'm afraid they need to handle.
Well, as we pivot over to Ukraine, and you'll be able to answer a question that I've been puzzled by with regard to these F-16s, that's a proxy war that is being waged. Ukrainians are getting funding from all kinds of countries to fight against the Russians. And of course, the Russians would probably have a much larger advantage, but for our munitions and our arms and everything. But if you look at it as a situation involving Israel, if Israel's left to defend itself, it's certainly going to be a proxy war with the Russians and maybe the Chinese and the Iranians funding the weapons and the supplies to the fighters, as well as the Houthis and the other terrorist organizations who would similarly be attacking Israel, right?
Well, now I'll tell you, it gets even more complicated than that. I'm glad you brought this up because I think it's really important here in that our bad policies in the Russia-Ukraine war, and especially with the change we had a couple of months back where Biden said, you know what, you guys, the Ukraine, you can use our weapons to strike into Russia
Right.
and on Russian territory. Putin then said, then since you're willing to do that, then we'll do a mirror image, a tit for tat kind of thing, and we'll give weapons and ammunition to your enemies elsewhere in the globe. He was unspecific. Now, just imagine if Iran, who's giving weapons to Russia that they need for their drones, goes to war with Israel. What are the chances that, oh, by the way, the former Minister of Defense from Russia, Sergei Shoigu, is in Tehran right now making military deals that Russia wouldn't give them weapons to potentially use against the United States in the area. So this web keeps getting wider because our policies remain stupid.
Okay, and pivoting over to stupid policies, the whole situation in Ukraine. I talked with Congressman Warren Davison just yesterday, and he is against continuing and funding this. He says he has been from the outset. But this whole situation, Ukraine has been clamoring for and asking for F-16s now since the whole situation unfolded. And here we are, fast forward, has it been 3 full years of war? We're roughly, give or take 6, 8 months, whatever. Now we're giving them F-16s?
Yeah, well, see, here's the problem. Number one, let's look at the tactical possibility. F-16s are going to give the Ukrainians a little more capacity. It will not change anything. But secondly, these things, it's not like, okay, well, when Russia invaded, we should have given them F-16s. You see, it took almost a full year to even get them to the point to where they can use these things. So it's a long lead time. And I assure you that these things, United States, we spent about 2 years training our pilots before we let them go into combat. Now then, these guys have had one, and even though you can say yes, but they were already trained pilots in the MiG-29s, et cetera, it's a very different aircraft and it fights different. We use the F-16s differently than they do use theirs. So it's a whole system of systems that have to be created on the fly. And listen, when you talk about aircraft, even if we gave them 90 over the next year and a half, assuming the war could last that long, which is apparently the plan, Russia has about 1,000 fourth and fifth generation fighters. So you're never going to close that gap. And so anybody who thinks that's going to make a difference is fooling themselves.
Well, and going back to the training, if the pilots of the F-16s we give to Ukraine have only a year of training, I have to imagine that the Russian pilots have a lot more training than that, and the F-16s might not be around very long.
Well, there's two things. The Russian F-35s and the Russian air defense system, especially the S-3, S-400, apparently some new S-500s that are coming online now, are very, very potent systems. And the Ukraine side is just not going to be able to stand up to that. There have actually been very, very few air-to-air engagements. As far as I know, there may not have been any, but if there was, there's some rumors there was one. That's it. So this is mainly an air defense system. And so when you get the F-16s in the air, the Russian S-3, 4, 500s are almost certainly going to take that out, or air-to-air missiles from the F-30, the S-35.
Always enjoy the discussion, Daniel. We'll talk next Tuesday. Stay well, my friend.